Section 6. Discrimination in Housing Based Upon Disability. Arizona Fair Housing 101. Looking Beyond What You Can See. After reviewing several fair housing hotline questions, Sarah looked up from her notebook. "I've noticed something," she said. "Many of the examples we've discussed involve disabilities." David nodded. "That's because disability is one of the most misunderstood areas of fair housing." He continued. "Most people immediately think of someone using a wheelchair." Sarah smiled. "I probably would have said the same thing. And that's exactly why we spend time discussing this topic." David explained that disabilities are not always visible. Some individuals have mobility impairments that are immediately apparent, while others may have hearing impairments, vision impairments, chronic medical conditions, mental health conditions, intellectual disabilities, or other physical or mental impairments that substantially limit one or more major life activities. "In many cases," David said, "you may never know a client has a disability." "And honestly," Sarah replied, "that's none of my business unless it affects the transaction." David smiled. "Exactly. As real estate professionals, we should never make assumptions about someone's abilities, limitations, or medical condition." The Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in nearly every housing-related transaction, including the sale, rental, financing, advertising, and management of housing. Federal law also protects individuals who have a record of a disability, or who are regarded as having a disability, even if those assumptions are incorrect. "The important thing to remember," David explained, "is that fair housing protects people, not labels." Reasonable accommodations. Sarah asked another question. "I hear people talk about reasonable accommodations all the time. What exactly does that mean?" David leaned back in his chair. "A reasonable accommodation is a change to a rule, policy, practice, or service that allows a person with a disability an equal opportunity to use and enjoy housing. For example, a tenant with a mobility impairment may request a reserved parking space closer to the building entrance, even though parking is otherwise unassigned. A condominium association may need to modify certain rules to allow a resident with a disability equal access to community amenities. A housing provider may also need to adjust procedures when doing so does not create an undue financial or administrative burden or fundamentally alter the nature of the housing program. Every request," David explained, "must be evaluated individually. There isn't a checklist that answers every situation." "Reasonable modifications," Sarah noticed another phrase in her notes. "What about reasonable modifications? Is that the same thing?" David explained that a reasonable accommodation changes a policy or procedure, while a reasonable modification involves a physical change to the property. Examples include installing grab bars, widening doorways, adding ramps, or making other accessibility improvements that allow a person with a disability to fully use and enjoy their home. "The terms sound similar," David explained, "but they're very different." Understanding that distinction helps licensees communicate more effectively with buyers, sellers, landlords, tenants, and property managers. Avoid making assumptions. David shared another story from his years as a broker. "I once had an agent tell a buyer, 'This house probably won't work because of your wheelchair.'" Sarah's eyes widened. "They were trying to help, I know. But that's the buyer's decision, not the agent's." Fair housing requires licensees to present available properties that meet the buyer's stated search criteria without making assumptions about whether a property is suitable for someone with a disability. Instead of deciding for the client, provide accurate information about the property's features and allow the buyer to determine whether the home meets their needs. "The more choices we provide," David explained, "the better we serve our clients." Group homes and fair housing. Sarah asked whether fair housing protections also applied to group homes. "They do," David replied. "Individuals with disabilities often live in group homes or other supportive housing arrangements. Federal fair housing laws generally prohibit local governments from using zoning or land use regulations to unfairly exclude housing for individuals with disabilities. Communities must evaluate these situations based on fair housing requirements rather than stereotypes or public opposition." As with reasonable accommodations, each situation depends on its specific facts. Accessibility in multifamily housing. David explained that fair housing extends beyond individual transactions. It also affects the design and construction of certain multifamily housing. Federal law requires many multifamily residential buildings first occupied after March 13, 1991, to include specific accessibility features, such as accessible entrances, accessible routes, wider doorways, accessible common areas, and usable kitchens and bathrooms. Although most Arizona real estate licensees are not responsible for designing buildings, Understanding these requirements helps agents recognize accessibility features and answer general client questions. Questions regarding building code compliance or design requirements should always be referred to qualified professionals. Never assume what a client with a disability can or cannot do. Present every property that meets the client's request and search criteria. Answer questions honestly and allow the consumer to determine whether the property meets their needs. Your role is to provide equal access to housing opportunities, not to decide which homes are appropriate for your clients. Online discussion question 1. Why is it important for real estate professionals to avoid making assumptions about individuals with disabilities? Answer. Disabilities are not always visible, and fair housing laws require equal treatment. Making assumptions may unintentionally limit a consumer's housing choices or create a fair housing violation. Question 2. What is the difference between a reasonable accommodation and a reasonable modification? A reasonable accommodation changes a rule, policy, or procedure, while a reasonable modification involves a physical change to the property that allows a person with a disability to fully use and enjoy the housing. Question 3. Why should a buyer, not the real estate agent, decide whether a property meets their accessibility needs? Answer. Fair housing laws require agents to provide equal housing opportunities. Buyers should make their own decisions based on accurate information rather than assumptions made by the licensee.